Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on the Weird Gun Iceberg. I'm Darth Brandybuck, where today I'm here at my house and we're going to be looking at level 6 of the Weird Gun Iceberg, which is for those folks who probably have the Curio and Relic page of Gunbroker bookmarked to your toolbar. Now if you recognize even half of the guns on this list, then consider yourself a true gun nut, and you probably bought a VR headset just so you could play hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades. So let's bring the camera over to the bookshelf and we'll take a look. But to keep things at least a little bit familiar, let's go ahead and start off as always with another goofy shotgun, another goofy Russian shotgun, a goofy Russian farming shotgun? The OF-93 Tulyok was a single-shot, multi-purpose farming gun that used a squeeze cocker similar to the HKP-7 to charge the action. It was chambered for what was basically a 4-gauge shotgun shell, but could also be modified to fire 12-gauge as well. There was a police version made as a cheap and simple alternative to the KS-23 that could be used for crowd control or modified to shoot gas grenades or flares, but it never really saw much success in any application with civilians or law enforcement. Now the Russians obviously have a pretty heavy influence on Asian and Eastern European weapons, and back during the aftermath of World War II, there was an excess of Soviet arms and ammunition left behind, but there was also a decent amount of American weapons that stuck around as well, either left by soldiers when they went home, or given to sympathetic forces, or salvaged off of dead soldiers. The Chinese came up with the resourceful idea of using an American gun to fire surplus Russian ammo, and remade the Thompson submachine gun to fire 7.62 Tokarev rounds. And typical of unlicensed Chinese ripoffs, they also misspelt the name, so the gun actually says Thampson. Now there's a couple different Chinese Thompson ripoffs from both before and after the war, and there's even one that uses the banana mags of the PPSH, but the Thampson is certainly the funniest example. The UDG Mark I was a pepperbox underwater gun that was more or less the American equivalent to the Russian SPP-1. It was preceded by an even more experimental underwater pistol based around the gyrojet that didn't really work out, but this one did at least see some limited use until the arrival of the HKP-11, which, as you can expect from our favorite German space wizards, is really weird and really cool. It was developed in the 70s as a better contender to the SPP-1 for use by NATO-aligned soldiers, and it's also a pepperbox-style revolver that uses a battery housing in the grip to electrically set off the charges and fire the gun. The 5-round barrel clusters come preloaded from H&K with the shells actually threaded into place, and there are both flechette and standard bullet variants. These barrel clusters can quickly be swapped out and are reusable, but they have to be sent back to the factory to be reloaded first. Now if you thought that the Pancor Jackhammer was the only weird bullpup revolving combat shotgun from the 1980s, then you'd be wrong, because there's also one that came out of Brazil called the Enarm Pentagun. It fires double action only and is charged with a pull ring under the carry handle very similar to the prototype AR-15. Pulling the trigger moves the barrel back about 1.5 millimeters into a recess on the cylinder chamber to form a seal, meaning that you could, at least in theory, suppress the thing. The Pentagun was intended to be sold on both civilian and police markets, but as far as I could tell, only one model of each version was ever made to completion. There's obviously been a lot of prospective experimental guns made for police use that never entered production, and we've talked about quite a few of them already, but another one is a carbine version of the classic Desert Eagle, which is little more than just the base gun with an elongated barrel and a buttstock added on. Operationally, it's exactly the same as the pistol, but as you can expect, there wasn't exactly a need or a demand for these, so none were ever made beyond the prototype. The AS-44 and AT-44 were experimental rifles based on the SVT-40 and originally chambered for 7.62 by 41, which were later developed into 7.62 by 39. Production and testing took place in 1944 and 1945, but the AS-44's development stopped abruptly when its designer Alexei Sudiev died in 1946, and the AT-44 followed soon after. Both were part of the testing program to find new rifles for the Russian military after World War II, and they both saw several different iterations during their development, with different modifications to their operation changing between different prototype models. Many elements of both guns would end up serving as inspiration to Mikhail Kalashnikov in developing his AK-47. Now, if it wasn't clear, one of the subgenres of weird guns that specifically fascinate me are goofy shotguns, and the German Steinkamp SW-1 has got to be one of the best examples. It's a bullpup lever-action breech-loaded double-barrel shotgun designed for use in hunting. It's pretty darn niche and to my knowledge has never made its way over to the US, but it has been in production since at least the late 2000s, and there are different versions made for 410, 20 gauge, and various other rifle rounds as well. Keeping up with German weapons, let's talk about the Panzerbusch 39 and Granatbusch 39. Now the first was an anti-tank rifle from World War II, and the name literally means tank rifle. Its predecessor, the PB38, was a single-shot rifle with a self-ejecting mechanism that locked open for reloading, but it was very prone to jamming due to that complicated mechanism. Now the PB39 kept the same basic operation but improved on its shortcomings, and it saw use all the way to the end of the war, but like many other anti-tank rifles designed in the 30s, it became basically inadequate as an anti-tank weapon due to armor advancements throughout the 40s. The GB39 was a short-barreled variant that fired special grenades using a modified Kar-98 grenade adapter and would launch barrel-mounted grenades by firing a wooden bullet into the back of them and then flinging them towards the target. Now, jumping ahead a few years, we have the Deer gun, which was a Vietnam-era guerrilla gun designed by the CIA to be distributed to southern Vietnamese forces. It's halfway between the Altor 9 and the FP45 Liberator that I've covered in the past, but basically it's just a very simple design that fires using a spring-loaded plunger, similar to low-end foam dart blasters. Only about 1,000 were produced as a proof of concept before things in Vietnam ramped up into full-scale war, so distribution was ultimately seen as impractical, and most are believed to have either been lost or destroyed by now. Another pistol briefly tested for U.S. military service was the White-Merril 1907. Now, Joseph White and Samuel Merrill designed the gun together with the intention of providing a handgun that had all the benefits and none of the drawbacks of both an autoloader and a revolver, and while that's a very admirable goal on paper, it didn't really play out in reality because of the 110 rounds fired for testing and demonstration, the gun had over 40 different malfunctions and was promptly dropped. Its poor performance was most likely due to a needlessly complicated build because, in the endeavor to make it superior to other handguns, it was incredibly over-engineered. The gun's most identifying features were that it could load with both detachable box magazines and stripper clips, and it could also be cocked with a lever called a Chatellerault device that allows the shooter to basically charge the action with one hand. Only a handful of guns have been built with a Chatellerault device, and in most cases the lever portion is part of the trigger guard, but in the case of the White-Merril and a few others, it's an entirely separate external piece. Some examples of other pistols that use a Chatellerault device are, of course, the Chatellerault pistol, the Krag automatic pistol, the Lignos Einhand 2A and 3A, the Shevchenko pistol, the Type 77, and of course the White-Merril 1907. Another goofy pistol was the Stoehr machine pistol, which is basically the bastard love child of the American 180 and the Bushmaster arm pistol. It was very experimental, never really saw any serious production, and really all that exists of it now are photographs of the prototype, so there's not really a whole lot of info out there about it, but it was certainly still worth mentioning. Now next is a gun that technically only exists in fiction, but it was at least a very real concept. The MRC was a proposed New Age rifle designed by Crye Associates, who are best known for developing several famous camouflage patterns. Now, only a few non-firing mock-ups were ever built before the design was abandoned, but it would have, in theory, used 6.8 caseless ammunition with a secondary underbarrel grenade launcher. It's, of course, probably most well known for appearing in the Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter games, where most information on the MRC actually comes from. But it's not the only concept assault rifle to show up in a video game that was never actually produced. There's a whole host of guns that never made it off the drawing board in real life that were commemorated in digital form, and we'll talk about a few more over the next few videos, but the one I'm going to talk about right now was the Wimmersperg SPZ. It was in development at the end of World War II as a cheaper alternative to the STG-44 that could be mass-produced and distributed quickly and cheaply. It's essentially a Franken-gun made up of parts from the STG itself and the British Sten. Now, there were plans for 3 different variants, one with a full-length barrel and 2 distinct short-barrel versions, one even being a bullpup, but it's believed that no working models were ever produced, with only blueprints and design notes ever being recovered. Germany also explored a similar concept to complement the MP40 with a cheaper and easier to produce submachine gun called the EMP44. Now, the Wehrmacht denied the gun's adoption due to its crude design, but a small number were still produced in 1944 as a last-ditch attempt to arm the Volkssturm, However, the guns were intercepted by American troops en route, and the factory was captured by Soviet forces. And funnily enough, it was actually briefly trialed by both the American and British military post-war, and while it was deemed a completely competent and functional weapon, it was also incredibly crude and simple, and so it was never actually chosen for use. Now, I haven't talked about any goofy palm pistols in a while, but luckily we've got the Tribuzio ring trigger pistol to scratch that itch. It's an Italian squeeze-fired palm pistol from 1890, adjacent to other squeeze guns like the Gaulois. As the name implies, the Tribuzio ring gun is fired by pulling back on the ring trigger, which activates the striker and engages the ejector at once, spitting out a spent shell and firing the next live one at the same time. As with most other palm pistols of the time, there wasn't really much of a market or really even a reason for the Tribuzio, so only a few hundred were ever made, but they're still at least unique and fun to talk about, even if they weren't really all that much of a success. Designed by Frank F. Burton and produced by Winchester, the Burton LMR was intended to serve as a ground defense weapon during World War I. It held and fed off of twin-canted, top-loaded magazines, but fired off of one at a time. It also had a second trigger underneath the trigger guard that served as the fire selector, where holding it down locks the sear and allows the bolt to cycle freely on automatic fire. The charging lever was oriented on the bottom of the frame and the gun ejected shells downward, so it was also fully ambidextrous. The gun was very forward-thinking and highly adaptable for the time, and it could be considered one of the first true assault rifles. There's very little information on the Burton since most records of the gun's development and military testing has been lost, but we do know that it was never adopted for service and never made it out of the prototype stage, and only one model is still believed to exist today and can be seen on display at the Cody Firearms Museum. Next up is the Bushmaster M17S, which is basically just one of many bullpupped AR-18 variants. The development history of the M17S started in 1986 when Australian company Armtec Limited developed the first prototype under the model designation of C60R as a potential option for the Australian Army. They also made a second version called the C30R that used caseless ammunition and was similar in concept to the HKG-11, but it was much less refined of a design, and the gun exploded during a testing demonstration, so Armtec just abandoned the idea afterwards, and the Australian Army ended up adopting a license-built version of the Steyr AUG instead of the C60. The entirety of Armtec would then be bought out by Eden Pine Priority Limited, who continued improvements on the design into the M17S. The biggest modifications they made was using parts from the Finnish Valmet rifle rather than the AR-15, but this was primarily just to cut down on costs. Eden Pine licensed out the design to Bushmaster for manufacture and sale in the US, and it was in production from 1992 to 94 when Eden Pine went under and the production of the gun transferred entirely to Bushmaster, only for the federal assault weapons ban to go into effect a few months later. However, the M17 was the only bullpup rifle being sold on the commercial civilian market at the time that was actually never explicitly mentioned by name, so the ATF allowed the gun to still remain in production so long as the barrel sleeve was modified to cover the muzzle thread, meaning that you couldn't put a flash hider or other muzzle device on it. Because that, of course, would make it far too scary. And speaking of assault rifles, we all know that the STG-44 is often labeled as the first successful assault rifle to ever see serious production and official military use, but its development didn't just come out of nowhere, nor did it stop after the STG was made. Two of its most direct predecessors are the MKB 42W and 42H, the MKB meaning Machine Carabiner, and the letters after the number standing for Walther and Haenel, the actual producers of each model. They were competitors in the lead up to the STG-44's production and were made under a very specific set of requirements, but after several rounds of testing and redesigns, the 42H was chosen as the most competent design, and a few final modifications were made that resulted in the STG-44. An improved design of the rifle went into development almost immediately, designated as the STG-45, and it was built with a roller-delayed firing mechanism, which was one of a few different changes that would have made it a slightly simpler and cheaper follow-up to the STG-44, at least in theory, but obviously the war ended before the gun went beyond the prototype stage, but its design would later be picked up by the French as the CM1950, which would develop into the CETME-58, and of course eventually the HKG-3. The Soviet Union had its own list of post-war prototypes, many being developed at the Tula arsenal. Various guns were designed for multiple Soviet weapon trials all throughout the Cold War, some as contenders to Kalashnikov's designs, and others competing in post-World War II Soviet military trials. Many were designed by Korobov and Stechkin and often bore the designation of TKB or AO. The ones I'll talk about here are probably the most recognizable, but there are a few even more obscure ones that I'll mention in parts 7 and 8. The AO-62 was an early predecessor to the AN-94 with a similar hyperburst operation that fired 3 rounds before felt recoil is transferred to the shooter. It was designed in 1965, preceding even the G11. The AO-63 is essentially a double-barreled, double-magazined AK-74, so basically just 2 AKs welded side by side. It was briefly trialed against and lost out to the AN-94 as well. The TKB-408 was an early bullpup proposed as a replacement to the SKS, but it lost out to the AK-47. The TKB-09 was another contender to the AK in the 1946 weapon trials, and it operated on a cable-mounted bolt that moved off of a spring mounted above the barrel, and it was probably the earliest predecessor to the system seen in the AN-94. The TKB-022 P1, P2, PM, and PM5 were intended as a series of New Age rifles in the 60s to be quick, cheap, and easy to make and use. The bodies of the guns make extensive use of Bakelite furniture rather than wood, metal, or polymer, and they ejected rounds forward next to the barrel. They have very nostalgic, techno-Stalinistic vibes in concept, but in reality, the ergonomics and the form factor of the guns were far too unusual to be practical. The TKB-059 was a 3-barreled bullpup that used a 3-row magazine that fed and fired independently, effectively making it like shooting 3 rifles at the same time. It was ambidextrous and ejected rounds straight downward from the rear, and obviously was far too complicated and cumbersome of a design to be practical as well. The TKB-517 and 523 weren't all that special, but they were essentially Korobov's contenders to the AKM and the RPD or RPK. The TKB-072 was designed in the 70s as a rifle that could maintain operation in any unorthodox position, such as lying prone, apparently. The idea was basically that it would fire no matter how it was being held, but it had, as you can expect, way too complicated of a build, so it was never accepted for service. The weirdest element to the gun's design was the ejection port, which was situated like under and between the trigger guard, and it spat shells out through a chute like in front of the grip. Super weird. The TKB-0146 was designed by Stechkin for the Project Akaban weapon trials in the 1980s, which was basically the Russian version of the American ACR program. It trialed next to the AN-94 and also had the same 2-round hyperburst fire, but rather than operating on a cable and pulley mounted bolt, the 0146 used a dual trigger setup where the front trigger could be partially pressed for single fire and then fully pressed to engage a smaller secondary trigger behind it to enable automatic fire. The 0146 was actually received favorably but lost out to the AN-94 for the simple reason that it got dirtier quicker. Now let's go back to talking about a few more American prototypes, first up being the Barrett XM109, which was not anti-personnel, not anti-tank, but anti-material. If you thought the classic M82 couldn't get any bigger, then think again, because the XM109 is basically just a conversion kit for the M82 that changes it from a 50 cal sniper rifle to a 25mm grenade launcher. It's seen some limited use in special applications, but is still technically an experimental design, and is neither an officially cancelled program or an officially adopted weapon, despite being in use since 1994. Now, back in 1919, the US military started looking for a new rifle to replace the Springfield as the standard issue rifle. One proposed design came from John Pederson, the same guy who made the Pederson device I talked about in the last video. But this other design of his was not a modification to a pre-existing rifle, it was an entirely new one. It was probably one of the top contenders to be chosen instead of the M1 Garand, but the initial build that Pederson presented wasn't quite up to snuff. However, Pederson was so confident that his gun would win the weapon trials that he traveled overseas to market the gun to US allies, not knowing that John Garand had already improved and refined his own rifle, and that the US military had chosen it over Pederson's. Despite losing out to the Garand in the US, Britain and Japan both took interest in the rifle as well before also rejecting it for other options. Now, in the case of the Japanese, they would actually make a few reworks of the rifle called the Type Ko and the Type Hei, but neither saw widespread use either. The main issue with the Pederson design in Japan was that it failed to feed and fire 6.5 Aerosoc cartridges reliably, so the Japanese ultimately decided to pursue homegrown Japanese guns instead, which didn't really work out too well because a lot of Japanese guns made in the lead up to World War II were pretty bad. Case in point, the Nambu Type 11, which was a Japanese light machine gun loosely inspired by the Hotchkiss, and aside from atrocious ergonomics, had probably the worst feeding mechanism I have ever heard of. It wasn't belt fed, it wasn't even magazine fed. It used a hopper that you would drop individual stripper clips into. Now, a hopper is basically just a funnel that feeds rounds into the firing mechanism, the simplest example being most paintball guns where you kind of just dump loose ammo into the hopper and it feeds into the gun through a funnel as you fire. Now, with paintballs that are all the same exact shape no matter what way they're oriented, feeding isn't really an issue, but with rifle cartridges, dumping a bunch of loose rounds would almost never work. So to at least attempt to somewhat reliably feed the gun, you would slot in up to 6 stripper clips into the hopper, and the Type 11 would, at least in concept, feed rounds off of each clip one at a time, and then drop them out when empty. The perceived advantage of this system was that any Japanese soldier could supply ammo to a Type 11 if needed just by taking a clip from the Aerosoc rifle and giving it to the machine gunner, but the obvious disadvantage was that anything else could be dumped into the hopper on accident, meaning that the gun was extremely prone to jamming. Although it saw service all the way through the war, it was slowly phased out for the Type 96, which is often mistaken as a Japanese remake of the Bren, but it's actually more of a mishmash of the Type 11, the Hotchkiss, and the ZB26. Parts for each individual gun were handmade, hand-fitted, and often had unique adjustments or modifications, meaning that while the overall design was the same, no two Type 96s were alike, and most parts were not interchangeable between guns. Now, they operated fine for the most part, but one of its biggest flaws, and one that actually plagued many Japanese guns from this time period, was that cartridges did not often cycle reliably and had to either be pre-lubed before being loaded, or the gun itself was built with an internal lubricating system. The Lewis Assault Phase was an experimental variant of the Lewis gun that was built as a new competitor to walking fire guns like the BAR or Shosha at the end of World War I. It traded out the top-mounted pan magazine for a more standard box magazine under the gun, but otherwise operated pretty much the same way. And it could be argued that it was one of the earliest examples of a true battle rifle, but it was never accepted for service. The Krieghoff Fallschirmjägergewehr was a prototype rifle made for German paratroopers in World War II, and was one of the initial contenders to the FG42, but the design was lost out and abandoned. It was similar in design and operation to the FG42, largely because it aimed to meet all the same requirements, but only a handful were ever built for weapon trials. The Silver and Fletcher Expert was an auto-ejecting revolver built off of the mechanism of the Webley revolver, and while it did have a traditional loading gate and plunger to eject spent shells in the slower but more traditional way as a backup, the primary loading mechanism, or rather unloading mechanism, used a lever connecting from the hammer to the edge of the cylinder that would hook onto the rim of spent cartridges and literally scoop them out as the cylinder rotated. It also had a rotating firing pin that could be locked back and thus rendered the gun unfireable and therefore safe to carry while still fully loaded, and you could also reload empty chambers. And as cool as all of that is mechanically, it was only made in small numbers, mostly because the guns were far too expensive and complicated for most people. The Chatellerault M29 was a light machine gun made in 1924 and was still being used by certain French forces all the way to 2006. It was built as a follow-up to the Shosha and served the purpose of what we would probably call nowadays the designated squad automatic rifle. It was heavily inspired by the BAR action, so in simplest terms, it's just a cross between that and something like the Bren. It has 2 triggers, one for semi and one for full auto, and was very versatile, very reliable, and well built, and has seen use by over a dozen different countries around the world over the years. As for another more niche gun, the California Arms Defiance was a double-barreled aluminum frame shotgun produced in the 1920s and was marketed as a simple and budget-friendly. The California Arms Defiance was a double-barreled aluminum frame shotgun produced in the 1920s and was marketed as a simple and budget-friendly home defense weapon. Rather than being a full-size shotgun cut down and repurposed, The Defiance was always and only ever built with a pistol grip, short barrel, and no stock, and it fires using manually primed plunger locking strikers on the back of the gun that you would pull back and lock into battery, much like a low-tier Nerf gun. They didn't sell too well, as only around 300 were ever actually made. Now, we've talked about a lot of Darne guns on this list, but the next one is actually, in fact, a Darne gun. It might actually be pronounced Darne, I don't know. It uses a belt feed system that pulls ammo backwards off the belt first and then moves it forward into the barrel. It was offered as a cheaper domestic alternative to the Lewis gun, but World War I ended before it went under contract with the French military. The design was later modified into an aircraft gun that saw some limited use in the interwar period, but after the German invasion of France, the few still around were distributed to the coastal areas of the occupation zone. Now, if you ever wondered what would happen if the Soviets tried to turn the Mosin Nagant into the Milkor, then you'd basically get the Kulakov. It was basically just a Mosin with the front half cut down right at the action, and the entire front end was then replaced with a new assembly made up of a 5-round rotating magazine cylinder and a new barrel. You would then load the gun with blanks, and firing the blanks would then launch the grenades before the expanding gases pushed against the barrel, sliding it forward and engaging the loading mechanism, circulating and readying the next grenade to fire. As what is probably the first revolving grenade launcher, the design was far from refined and had way too many mechanical issues to be practical, but it was at least in theory a cool idea, and for basically being little more than just a proof of concept, the fact that it worked at all is pretty impressive. Now, jumping back to German light artillery from World War II, the Panzerbusch MSS-41 was the first bullpup rifle to see official military service. It was used as an anti-tank weapon starting in 1941, but like many other guns of its class, was deemed obsolete within the next few years. Now, it was technically a bolt action, but you actually had to cycle the entire pistol grip assembly due to the larger internal parts it needed to fire the 7.92 by 94 Patronin rounds. The gun was produced out of Czechoslovakia and really only saw limited service in that general area. The Denel Neopup Unkuzi PA is a South African designed grenade launcher that uses proprietary 20x42 cartridges built off of the same 20mm rounds used in autocannons like the M61 Vulcan you see on things like F-16s or naval defense turrets. The trigger housing is built into the right face of the gun, which makes the rest of the gun's mechanism more streamlined and allows the bolt to reciprocate back and forth more directly. That more direct operation is very important for the PA to work because it fires using inertial mass very similar to the Huigren shotgun, so it literally relies on all of that weight inside being able to move back and forth freely. Its biggest advantages are higher velocities and flatter trajectories compared to a 40mm grenade, and a much simpler and more reliable build to launchers like the XM25 or K11 because it doesn't use any advanced smart tech or computers, but due to it being able to fire all kinds of different 20mm rounds, it's still very effective as an anti-personnel or anti-vehicle weapon. Although it's been tested by a number of different militaries and private security forces, the PA has only ever seen very limited use around the world and is probably most notable for being featured in a couple of Neil Blomkamp's movies like District 9 and Chappie. Well guys, we've only got 2 levels left of the Weird Gun Iceberg. I really appreciate everyone who has followed along this far, and I'm especially thankful to all of you new subscribers who got me past 8,000. I really appreciate it. I know a couple of you have commented about some guns that I haven't included on the list, so if I get enough of them, I might actually do a 9th, bonusberg episode. So if there's weird guns that you haven't seen yet that you'd like to hear me talk about, go ahead and let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you all for watching, thank you for sticking around, and I will see you all back here next time. Goodbye, everyone.